one of the major and most worrisome arguments that I've heard recently from people whom I otherwise have really deep admiration for was a point that John Verwicki was recently making, that supposedly fundamentalism is the result of modernity. It is a modern phenomenon. And I think this gets everything wrong. It gets not only modernity wrong, but it gets fundamentalism wrong. And it even gets the good parts of fundamentalism wrong, which there are. And it basically totally misreads and misinterprets the situation, I believe, on all accounts. It doesn't see the value in modernity, where it is, and it doesn't see the value of fundamentalism itself as an attitude. And roughly the argument goes that fundamentalism is the result of the propositional attitude, which is an attitude which looks at reality in terms of relationships between concepts that we can wave. Propositions are, as far as I understand, basically relationships between concepts. Like, for example, the sun is yellow. Right? This is a proposition. It's a claim about reality where you relate one concept, the sun, to another concept, yellowness. And breaking reality down into such conceptual thinking, such linear thinking, if you want, supposedly something that is relatively new, and something that can be pinpointed down to starting with modernity and Descartes. Of course, you can track roots of it much further down the line, but the general idea still remains that this form of thinking itself produces fundamentalism. This form of thinking itself is linear in nature. It sees linear connections between concepts. It cannot think in complex terms. It cannot think in contradictions. Its basic assumption is that if you contradict yourself, you're wrong. So, in other words, it cannot make two different statements about the same thing at the same time. It cannot think in terms of paradoxes. And thus it cannot think in multi-layered fashion. It cannot, for example, come up with multiple equally valid interpretations of one and the same event, or one and the same statement, or one and the same movie even. I mean, the movie has to have one meaning, and particularly when it comes to religious scripture, it doesn't allow for multiple different interpretations of the same scripture. Scripture must have one linear meaning, and that linear meaning is usually very literalist and usually very concrete. It's bound to concrete physical objects. For example, heaven is taken to be something that's literally in the sky up there, and not a metaphor for something else, right? Or the resurrection itself also is taken to be literally a physical, embodied coming into life again of a physically dead body, and not a metaphor for what's happening to your consciousness from moment to moment, as some of the mystics had it. And supposedly fundamentalism is basically the result of modernist thinking. It is a recent phenomenon, and is something that modernity co-produced unintentionally with some of its basic assumptions. This gets, again, both wrong, modernity and fundamentalism, because the good parts that I think John has not really mentioned about fundamentalism is fundamentalism establishes a boundary. And fundamentalism is not rooted in speculation. It's not rooted in one theory that Descartes came up with. It's not the result of Descartes coming up with a story that was so brilliantly convincing that it convinced entire generations, even generations stemming from an entire different cultural contexts. It convinced all of them to become, at the heart, Cartesians. That's the point that John is making. He's making the point, basically, fundamentalists today, no matter their religious creed, are at the heart of it, all of them Cartesians, right? This is something that's, by the way, very offensive to religiously fundamentalist thinking people, Christian or otherwise, because they consider themselves to be Christians. They don't consider themselves to be Cartesians, and they even consider themselves to be faithful Christians. John is making the deeper point here that they are not aware of their own Cartesian priming, which makes them interpret Christianity in such a flat and linear manner. And the starting point, I believe, is not a narrative that was so incredibly convincing to everybody else. If that, by the way, was true, Descartes is the biggest genius to have ever lived. He's better than Trump at convincing people to believe something they don't want to believe. He's the better seller. He is the best seller ever to have ever lived, and that's just not really. I don't think this is a very convincing picture of Descartes. Descartes was convincing to many people because he put intuitions that many people already had into a language that was comprehensible, and he used French. He didn't. He didn't mainly use Latin. So it was something that everybody could understand, and it could describe basic intuitions that people already had. Or as Wilber once put it, you can't really blame Descartes and Newton for the subject-object split, because the subject-object split is something that is prior there. It's something that's there in every single child, and even at a much further at a much lower age, by the way. We usually assume that the subject-object split happens quite far down the line when children are bigger and start to reflect, but it appears, more recent research has pointed out, that the subject-object split actually appears even within the first year of a child's development. So this is pretty early, before the child actually develops a meaningful language. It already perceives itself as distinct from its environment. And as Wilber put out, that's not something you can blame on Descartes and something that you can blame on Newton, but that's the way human consciousness develops even on a pre-verbal level. And when you're on a pre-verbal level, you are on a pre-cultural level. You are on a level where you can't bake convictions into the child yet, because it doesn't have the language. It doesn't understand those pre-convictions. It is on a very embodied level. And on the embodied level, what is there is, and what is distinguished is a relatively stable self-boundary, which simply designates there is me as a unit and there is the world out there, and the world can impinge on me as a unit also in ways that are hurtful, also in ways that are dangerous. And this is also something that, again, animals can make sense of. An animal understands danger. But the point here is, the moment you understand danger, the moment you understand that something can impinge on you in a painful, in a hurtful way, you have already assumed yourself to be an identity. You have distinguished yourself from your environment. In children, oftentimes it's said that the crucial point at which children make this distinction to a semi-conscious degree is when they say no to something, right? This is also not something that's from the start there, but there is a point when children start even articulating the no, which is a clear, this is me, this is my world, this is my internal experience, and I set a boundary and say no to something that impinges on me from the outside world. And this is a pre-verbal experience to a large extent. And this experience itself has a very, very clear shape. It's not multidimensional, it's not something that has multiple interpretations, but it is as concrete as you can get. And with this concreteness, that there is a boundary, I'm within it, there is something that's outside of this boundary. With this concreteness, every single child starts out. Children start out with concreteness. They don't start out with metaphors and with symbolic thinking. They act out symbolism, but they don't think in symbolic terms. In the terms in which they start thinking about reality are linear. The terms in which they start thinking about reality in terms of object permanence, of units that they can clearly distinguish from each other. And even the distinguishing of units, of seeing that things are not the same thing, that they have to separate them mentally into different things that are then in some way related, is already a challenge enough for most children. But that's the way that children start out thinking, and that's the way children start out speaking about the world. Children start out speaking in a concrete way about the world. They start out speaking in propositional terms about reality. Again, this is not something you can blame on Descartes and something you can blame on Newton, but it's at the heart of how we think. At the heart of how we think is we start out with the most basic sense, the most basic intuition for us is our own identity, of us being us and the world being something surrounding us. So at the heart of thinking itself lies the distinction between me as a unit, and even the idea of me being a unit, and everything else. And the moment you start from here, you build a concrete language, because you then treat everything else as in terms of a unit, in terms of being something single. From the experience of you being single, of you being one perspective looking into the world, comes the projection that everything else must be one in this sense as well. So from there, I believe, comes our deeply inadequate way of treating reality, because we treat reality as being composed of other such units. At first, those units are objects. They are physical units. Then we start thinking of them as subjects, as having their own mental world, but still being units. But in both cases, this projection of unity that comes from us, from our own experience of us being one unit of experience, is inadequate. And this is something we figured out in physics, and this is something that we're starting to figure out in all other domains, in all other disciplines. We never can really find any real units. In physics, we can't really find anything that is resembling to what we imagine an atom to be. The atom is something that we imagine to be a self-enclosed, self-standing unit that is distinct from its environment. We can never find those units. The same thing with sociology. We don't find ever units in these terms. In sociology, there are no we spaces that are just a unit that has a clear boundary and that is clearly distinct from everything else. And these are different topics, but I think the general intuition here is, and this is something I've never heard other people mention, but I believe the fact that we treat reality as unit-like and seek out units in reality is the result of us experiencing ourselves as subjects and us experiencing ourselves as indivisible and self-standing units. And this is, again, something that is there before you can speak. This sense of you being a unit, something that is whole and something that is distinct from whatever is happening to you, is more foundational, is more basic than your ability to even speak about reality. And it's something that even your way of speaking about reality can't really unhinge. Even if you were to say, I won't speak about myself as a unit, I won't speak about myself as a self or as an I looking into the world, it won't change the fact that you experience your way this way. And it's not language that made us believe we are selves. And this is a different topic, but I think this is one of a different misreading of how supposedly language basically crystallizes this wrong view of the self as being a unit, and therefore you have to deconstruct it through meditative experience and figure out you're one with everything. This is most of that is just poppycock. I'm sorry. This is a misinterpretation of spiritual experience, and this is bad psychology at the same time. As Wilber once said it, this is really bad terminology, and this is really bad spirituality at the same time. It postulates unity where there is no unity, but that's a different topic. I'm getting into different areas here, but the initial starting point was, okay, propositional thinking as supposedly something that modernity gave rise to, and thus fundamentalism actually is the result of modernity. That's poppycock. At the heart of fundamentalist is this concrete way of thinking, which is at the foundation of how children in general perceive reality. Every child starts out with that. Every child starts out with the assumption that there are other units in this world that are very much like itself, like its own unit of consciousness that it immediately experiences. And from that results that the stories that children start to develop are relatively linear. They are composed of individuals that are oftentimes put in relationship with each other and oftentimes don't have very, very clear boundaries. And it is often perceived as a development in a child's thinking when a child can actually start to differentiate those relationships and doesn't treat them as two solid units, but can differentiate further down the line. I think this is the result of a child intuitively feeling that you can't put everything down into one single concept, that there are many ways of experiencing a figure, a role of something. Something can be good in one context, but if you place it in a different context, it appears as bad. And this multi-faceted way of relating to objects, whatever is out there in the world, I believe, makes a child intuit that linearity itself has its limits. And it's interesting how children try to play around with that. How children try to avoid very, very strict linearity. But linearity is still at the heart of how they think about reality insofar as they can think about reality at all. And that's something that I believe happens on the cultural level as well. It's something that has a positive aspect to itself, which is just as your self-identity is something that is not just about you lingering in yourself and about yourself, but it has the positive value of establishing a meaningful boundary between you as a psychological unity and your environment, you having different interests oftentimes from your environment, and you having to protect those interests. This establishes a meaningful boundary, and in a very, very similar way, linear narratives do exactly that. They establish in an analogous, fashion, a relatively stable boundary that is an extension of your self-identity. It's an extension of this sphere-like sense of who you are. And as long as it has a relatively stable boundary, you feel secure. As long as it has a relatively stable boundary, you feel like you know where you end and where the outside world begins. If you take that away, and this is the worst thing you can do, and even when you speak to fundamentalists, the worst thing you can do is shatter their worldview. Because what happens is, the result is not openness and being open to learning and being open to taking in the world. The result usually is the very opposite: absolutely destroyed psychologies which are incapable of meaningfully interacting with the world anymore, because they can't relevance realize, as John Vervaeke puts it. They can't put a place. They can't place value judgments. They can't make value judgments in meaningful ways, so as to meaningfully, stepwise, get from their own perspective into the world. What happens is that the world really, literally swallows you. And from this position, you become incapable of learning. You are then usually in a constant state of psychological stress and overwhelm, where you don't feel like you can meaningfully relate to anybody anymore. It's not extension, it's a total collapse of the self-system into a state which is not productive, into a state which is not the better if you compare it to the rather fundamentalist attitude, where you had a relatively stable self-boundary and the sense for who you are and where you're going. And that's the positive aspect of fundamentalism. It is something that's valuable to the individual as an individual. If it wasn't, it wouldn't have made it through history at all. I mean, if it was something that was just merely destructive for individuals, it would never have been passed on. But you can see this from being passed on from generation to generation. And you know, the funny thing is, when you listen to people who study fundamentalism, the point that was made, and this surprised me at the beginning, was, look, people who are fundamentalists are usually not the kind of losers as people imagine them to be. They oftentimes are the best people a culture has to offer. They are the most disciplined learners. They're those who spend the most time studying. They are those who are most devoted. They are not the losers that people make them out to be. They're oftentimes the most brave people coming from a culture. And this thing has an extreme power. Fundamentalism has an extreme power in its ability to spread not only across cultures, but across generations. When you think about the power, and this is something that you have to experience yourself first person, when you are surrounded by someone who has this kind of aura and who can speak in fundamentalist language, if you compare John Vervaeke's tone to somebody who can spread fundamentalist thinking, John Vervaeke becomes super boring. It's just like super unexciting. People who are capable of spreading fundamentalist thinking are capable of inspiring other people, are capable of enlightening a fire in them and sparking a fire in them. And this is not trivial. This is something that is a positive way, or a successful way, of sparking self-identity, a sense of who you are. And that's not trivial. It's not something I can do. When I speak to people usually are like, who cares? That's the way it usually goes. Being able to present people with a believable narrative of who they are and who they want to be is not something that's trivial. It's not something that's easy, and it's something that oftentimes some of the most gifted people among us are capable of actually doing. And none of that you hear from John. From John, at the end of the day, fundamentalist comes out as being something that's only pathological, that has no value to the individual whatsoever. It gets wrong the strengths of fundamentalism, and it gets wrong the pathologies of fundamentalism, because the pathologies of fundamentalism are actually its inability to open up beyond your own sphere of self-identity. And here modernity jumps in, because this is exactly where modernity has something to offer: how to open up your self-identity to other identities out there and not feel and experience them as only threatening to your own self, but to find an identity which is beyond beliefs, an identity which is beyond thinking of who you are and believing yourself to be someone specific. This is something that modernity brings into the picture, and the German word for it is thinking. Thinking in German, denken, doesn't just mean propositionally playing around with ideas, but thinking is a state of witnessing. It is a state of taking notice of whatever appears in your consciousness. And this is an absolute position in German idealism, by the way, which is giving you a sense of security, a sense of foundation, a sense of identity that is independent of the content that you're thinking about. This liberates you to become capable of thinking about the world in terms that contradict your own self-identity without being threatened by it. This liberates you to thinking in hypotheticals that imagine your own identity to be deconstructive, to be something that's hurtful, harmful to the world. This is something a pre-modern consciousness cannot bear, because in pre-modern consciousness this would mean that you would be potentially on the bad side of history, and this is something pre-modernity can't fathom. It cannot imagine being not on the good side of history. Modernity introduces into the picture that you will never be able to go to bed and sleep well again, because you will have to recognize that you're always feeling somebody's expectations, and you're always feeling the expectations put on you by your external reality. You will be always partly a bad guy, whether you like it or not, and you will have to figure out ways of living with that, and you will have to figure out a self-identity that can cope with that badness in meaningful ways, instead of just rejecting it and attempting to find moral purity from which supposedly you can then do atrocities and go to bed sleeping well and feeling like you've done the right thing. This is deeply anti-modern. The modern consciousness is that you will never be able to just go to bed and feel good about yourself. You will always have an element of deep pain that you experience in not living up to the expectations of the world surrounding you, but living with that pain constructively, integrating that pain as part of yourself. And this made me really furious, because I think it's an important topic, and John is otherwise so brilliant on so many issues, but the way he misreads this is so frustrating, because this is one of the major struggles that we find ourselves in as cultures, figuring out ways of constructively dealing with fundamentalism, and figuring out ways of taking from modernity what is actually worth taking and integrating, instead of living in fictions where you come up with ideas about how supposedly Descartes and Newton made the world, believe in something they didn't want to believe in, and speculating and doing armchair philosophy. And this is really frustrating, because armchair philosophy won't get us anywhere. The only thing that will get us anywhere is like living in these realities, first person, meeting people who have fundamentalist thinking, seeing how they experience the world, and mingling with them. It won't get us anywhere by third person talking about other people, how supposedly they are the result of Descartes. I feel this is extremely offensive. I'm sorry, I have to repeat this. I think it's one of the most offensive things you can say to someone who has religious convictions, that they are basically somebody who's a Cartesian and they don't even know about it, and they have just swallowed up a worldview that Descartes used to manipulate generations of people who are cultures apart.